So part of the spirit of Grammar and Chill is to celebrate and elevate the writers that we have here in Columbus. So I'm happy because these are my friends along with like professional writers, and we have these conversations all the time about writing and writer life. So we're gonna have it in front of y'all today. So, but before we get started, we have one more trivia question, which is, which of these writers recently took a trip to Africa? Oh. Okay, y'all follow them. Okay, that's half correct. That's half correct. Somebody wanna guess?
Everybody.
No, that's not. Somebody else wanna guess? The Chris. It was Chris and Bart. Oh. So it's just interesting the way we all kind of enter today. So I want to start off just with quick introductions, and then we can get into our convo. How y'all feeling?
Great.
Good.
Great.
Okay, awesome. Really good. So at the end, we have Chris Fournier. He's a journalist, author, and filmmaker, and playwright, originally from Columbus, Ohio. We have Barbara Fant, who is a poet and performer and artistic director, originally from Youngstown, Ohio, currently blessing Columbus, Ohio. And then we have Erica Thompson, a journalist, a pop culture writer, a Prince biographer, originally from Cincinnati and currently living in Columbus. So thank y'all for coming out for Lit Winter today. So our first question, our icebreaker question was, if you had a memoir, what would be the title? So I'm just like throwing that out to you.
I actually prepared something because I'm actually writing a memoir about growing up in an interracial family. So I wrote this, it's brief, I promise.
Yeah.
So this is actually, I want to say, so this is like growing up in an interracial family through a purple haze. What I mean by that is, I'm a Prince fan, Erica's a big Prince fan, I know Scott Woods is a big Prince fan. So this is about like my life growing up through the lens, with the backdrop of being a huge Prince fan. So I think the reason why I've always been such a big Prince fan is that the world he created was multicultural, and that's the world that I grew up in. My African-American parents, Shelley and Fred, were never married, and they both married white people. My stepfather, Doug, and my stepmothers, Christine and Anita. I have 4 biracial siblings, Doug, Beth, Tori, and Alexa. So when I saw Purple Rain in the summer of '84 at age 11, and I saw that Prince's character, the kid, had an African-American father and a white mother, I could totally relate. Now, of course, I later learned that this was a fictionalized version of Prince's life.
AUX mode.
Because it's like Prince calling from the grave. So as I later learned, both Prince's parents were light-skinned blacks, but I appreciated the inclusiveness not only on the screen, but in his multicultural, multi-gender band, The Revolution, and associates like Sheila E., who is Latino and African American. Another Prince associate, Morris Day, lead singer of The Time, in his recently published autobiography, On Time, A Princely Life in Funk, said that as a young black male, he didn't experience a lot of overt racism growing up in Minneapolis. Having been raised in a similar mid-sized Midwestern town like Columbus, I actually didn't either. Did the fact that I grew up in an integrated family and neighborhood help me navigate attending a predominantly white parochial school, Holy Spirit in Whitehall, actually not too far from here? It was while I was at Holy Spirit that my mom began to encourage me to take advantage of my fertile, some might say overactive imagination by enrolling me in creative writing classes. My teachers at Holy Spirit saw my potential and sent me to the Young Authors Conference a couple years in a row. And I continued to write poetry and plays while attending a predominantly black high school, Eastmore, and other schools where diversity was the norm, such as Fort Hays Career Center, where I took radio and TV, Columbus State, and Ohio State. My journalism career has been similarly diverse, starting out at African American newspapers Call and Post and Columbus Post, and going on to work at publications where I was the only black reporter, including the Daily Reporter, a business newspaper, and This Week News, a suburban publication. I've spent much of my career covering affluent white suburbs like Upper Arlington and Bexley, where I cannot afford to live. But I've not encountered any overt racism in these communities either, at least not that I was conscious of. I still freelance for the Bexley newspaper, and I just have to say, as a writer, I'm really conscious of how people use words. So there was this meeting in Bexley the other day to launch the city's bike safety plan, and so people were making these unintentional puns, and they didn't even realize it. Like they were saying, "I'm going to stay in my lane, and this is how I roll." So they were saying this unironically. So don't get me wrong. Just because I personally haven't experienced a lot of overt racism in my life doesn't mean that I'm under the illusion that racism doesn't exist. I've certainly been on the receiving end of microaggressions, and I'm well aware of the oppression that people of African descent have endured all over the world. I recently had the honor of traveling to Africa with a group of local artists that included Ms. Barbara Fant. Barbara and I were invited by Susan Bradford Kunta, executive director of the Lincoln Theater, to join her and her West African dance troupe, Chisan, on a pilgrimage to Senegal and Gambia over the holidays. I felt right at home there, especially in Senegal, which, like my family, has a Western influence via the French, but is firmly rooted in its Africanness, its blackness. It was interesting to see the paradox of being greeted with bonjour by someone wearing traditional African garb. And yes, Prince's music provided the soundtrack to my African experience. As the plane ascended into the air from New York's JFK, embarking on the 7-hour flight to Dakar, Senegal, I cranked Take Me With You from the Oscar-winning Purple Rain soundtrack, a staple of my headphones whenever I travel. And no trip, of course, would be complete without playing the title track to Prince's follow-up to Purple Rain, Around the World in a Day. Throughout my life, I've tried to take the opening lyrics to heart. Open your heart, open your mind. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, Barb, so tell us what's the title of your memoir, and if you want to talk a little bit more about your trip to Africa as well.
Yeah, mine is not as nearly as profound as that. When we talked at the table, I went with Bloom. It's an acronym. It's Barbara Lynette operating on Moon being the light that permeates the darkness. So I use that. I think I would probably use that. But I'm also working on a new poetry collection, and so I'm hoping to get it published. So prayers, please. But it's called My Gangsta, My Garden. And it's really just a series of poetry surrounding my life growing up in the hood, what that looks like, many of the characters that I met and who really just shaped my life growing up. And it's also dealing with my relationship with God and faith and that whole process. So, I mean, that's what I would use as my title. I guess I could talk a little bit more about my trip to Africa. It was fantastic. I'm still processing it all. I think it was really surreal. Senegal was beautiful. We went into 3 different areas in Senegal, and then we also went into Gambia. So, Chris spoke about being greeted with bonjour. Well, when you go into Gambia, they speak English. And so it was so fascinating to witness walking around with Nike and Fila, and everybody just looks just like you. I mean, it's just beautiful being home. That was my first time on the continent. And we did everything from Pink Lake to Goree Island, Door of No Return, to Kunta Kinte Island. It was just gorgeous, and I think that's where I broke down the most, was probably Kunta Kinte's Island. We were able to meet the last 2 living women from his line, which was super powerful. We also met a 97-year-old queen. And I think one of the things that was just so amazing to me was how rich in resources Africa is, and you realize that when you're there. So when we were in the area where we met the village of the 97-year-old queen, we stood under, there were 3 different trees, and to my right there was a eucalyptus tree, and right above me was a tree where, I forget the name, it was the mall tree, I think. And the leaves, if you boil them, they're supposed to cure diabetes. And then to the left, it was a tree where they make aspirin out of. and that's all in one village. You're just standing there, and so I still haven't processed it all. But one of the things that we were told when we got off of the boat near Pink Lake was, "Let the water come to you," and that became a real mantra for me throughout that time. Was "Let the water come to you." So that's something that I'm still writing about. Yeah.
All right, so Erica, tell us what's the title. Tell us what's the title. If you want to share that, I know it's kind of proprietary.
So I think my memoir would either be bingo halls and bowling alleys, or bowling alleys and bingo halls. I don't know which way. But that's where I spent a lot of my childhood, because my parents were like semi-professional bowlers, so we were always in different bowling alleys in the Cincinnati area. We went to San Jose, we go to Indianapolis, just all over. But I would always be writing in the bowling alleys, and then my mom and my grandma were always at bingo like every Thursday, so they would take me with them, and I would just be writing in bingo. And it's kind of funny how like your childhood talents or gifts like later become what you do as an adult, even if you run from them. So in college, I kept switching my major from English to music, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I got like really depressed and actually went to like 3 different schools before I graduated. But I eventually got a master's in journalism, and it's just funny how I'm writing now, even though I tried to run from it. So that's something I think about what I did as a kid and how it has come back. I'm writing a book about Prince's spiritual journey, because he was a Jehovah's Witness before he passed away, and I just thought that was interesting because we know him as like this sex symbol from Purple Rain, but he's like always been a spiritual person, and I just wanted to study that trajectory. So he has a song called "Willing to Do the Work," and so my working title is "Willing to Do the Work: The Spiritual Mission of Prince."
Thank you. So my first question to you, I'll answer it first. It is, when did you know that you were a writer? So for me, that happened when I was 13, and I'm really not good at anything else. Like writing, communication, like every other job outside of that, I've been fired from. So I can't do anything else but some type of writing. So when did you know that you were writers?
I think I was never not a writer. I was always making up stories in my head as a kid because I was partly raised by my grandparents. So it's weird, I sort of had 2 childhoods. Like when I was over at my mom's house, I was the oldest of my siblings. And then when I was over at my grandparents' house, my maternal grandparents, I was like the only child, even though they're my mother's parents, because they had an empty nest. So it's like the TV and my imagination were my babysitters. So I was just always making up stories, always writing stories down. And I mentioned in my little monologue, I guess you call it, that I went to the Young Authors Conference when I was a kid. So that's like when I was probably like in 3rd or 4th grade. That's when I realized like being a writer is like an actual profession, and it's like competitive, because like they gave out awards for like, I think we wrote essays, and I was like, oh, I got an honorable mention. I must not be as good as the rest of the people. So that's how I realized it's like being a writer is a job, and it's like you have to compete and try to be the best and hone your craft just like any other job.
Well, I was trying to think back. I've always liked to write. Like I always really liked writing. When I was really young, I think I was maybe in 2nd or 3rd grade. There was a competition to write poems and get them published in the newspaper. And I ended up getting like 2 of my poems published in the newspaper. And I was just so proud of that. I really liked writing. And then I remember being in middle school, and I wrote a paper on Mahalia Jackson. And my friend's mother was like, "You're a writer. You're really good at this. You're a writer. You should follow this." And I didn't really follow it. I kind of just veered away from it. I thought I was going to be a choreographer. I wanted to dance. I couldn't really dance. That was like my thing. I thought I could dance.
You did dance in Africa.
I did dance in Africa. Don't let them see the footage, but I did dance. And when I ended up when I lost my mother when I was 15. And I struggled. I struggled with praying. I struggled with talking to God. I struggled with doing it all. And I wanted to go to counseling. And my father was really religious. And he was like, no, you're going to church. And I didn't really understand what the pastor would say. So I would go to church and I would take notes. And I would go back home and write those notes into a poem. And that became my way of processing. And that's when I remember like the work actually coming to me in a different way. And I realized this is what I want to do. This is really what I want to do. And I saw Sonny Patterson perform, who's a poet out of New Orleans. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but that's what I want to do.
I think for me it's similar to Barb and Chris, elementary school, just writing all the time, writing in class and actually getting in trouble sometimes. Like, I remember there was this book, Harriet the Spy, that I read when I was in like 4th grade, and then I thought I was Harriet the Spy, so like I started carrying around a notebook, spying on people and writing. It got confiscated by the teacher. And then in like junior high, I would always write pages more for like my assignments than I needed to, and my teachers would yell at me and tell me to be more concise and more succinct. So I think it's just since I was little.
So what are some of the pros and cons of being professional writers and creatives and living in Columbus?
Well, the pro, of course, is like, it's a lower cost of living than if, we were living in New York or Los Angeles or a bigger city like Chicago where you lived before. I think the con is that you're not physically in the space where you can do a lot of networking. I mean, luckily with the internet now, you can contact people through websites and email or whatever, but I'm sure there are opportunities that we don't always get exposed to because we're here in quote unquote flyover territory.
Well, I think one of the pros for me as a poet is that Columbus is a hub for poets specifically. So Scott Woods is here, but I grew up under Scott Woods. I grew up under Will Evans, Ed Mabry. I grew up under Ed Mabry. Maggie Smith is here. These are like internationally known writers, big time writers. Hanise is here. So I think one of the pros is that I was able to grow up around this hub and this kind of like incubation, whereas other writers in other areas don't necessarily get that. But I was able to do that. So I think that's definitely one of the pros. One of the cons maybe is that you're always seen as like the underdog. Especially being a poet, kind of get looked over for a lot of people.
One of my favorite Scott Woods stories, is them talking about going to like poetry competitions and like when Columbus would show up, like get him a drink and let him tell you that story.
I think for me the pro is just there's such a rich Black history here in Columbus that I've been learning since I moved here in 2016. And being a journalist here, it really gave me the freedom to dig into that, and it just blows my mind all the time. Like the history, like the good and the bad, like the art scene, but then also like the history of racism here, which is really isn't that different from every other city. But I just felt like I moved here and I found a purpose in the type of writing that I'm able to do. A con, the journalism industry everywhere is just so unpredictable and heartbreaking, and you don't make a lot of money as a writer. And a lot of times, like my colleagues and I, we just talk about how long is it before we have to go into public relations or something. Like, how long can we keep doing this? And it's hard to leave because you feel like you have such a sense of purpose when you do it. So that's something that we struggle with every day.
So I have a couple questions for you individually, and then we'll wrap it in. And then when we end, if the audience has questions, you can ask those as well. So Chris, you're a journalist. Written fiction, nonfiction, and you're a documentary filmmaker. Which of those mediums do you like the best?
That's like, the cliche answer asking like which one of your kids do you like the best. Growing up, I never thought that you had to pick one. I always wanted to be a writer and a filmmaker, and I grew up idolizing people like, Debbie Allen. She's a dancer, and then she segued into being a director and producer. It's like, what does dancing have to do with film and television, or being behind the scenes in film and television? But she made the leap, no pun intended. And then Quincy Jones, Quincy Jones is a musician, but he produced The Color Purple. He got into film production. People like Gordon Parks, he started out as a photographer, then he became a movie director. So I never felt like you had to just pick one medium. The downside, and I actually just found the term that I can call myself, which is multimedia creative. It's like someone who's creative in several different mediums. But the downside is you're looked at as like someone who's like a dilettante, like you just like you dabble in a couple of different fields, but you don't like ever. It's like jack of all trades, master of none. So some people kind of see you that way. But I don't think that you have to choose one or say, I'm this over that. I think it's just all stems from the same source of creativity, for me at least.
So you wrote a book about the famous comedy club, All Jokes Aside in Chicago.
Yeah, and I have to clarify, it was an autobiography. Raymond Lambert's the owner of All Jokes Aside in Chicago.
So talk to us about that story, how it came to you.
Yeah, so it was interesting. So the documentary that I made is called Lady Wrestler, and it's about black women from Columbus who were world famous professional wrestlers back in the 50s and 60s. So I was in the middle of putting that together. And then actually, Will Haygood, who's a journalist from Columbus, he wrote the article that the movie The Butler was based on. We started out at the Call and Post together, not at the same time, but whenever he would come through town, he would stop in at the Call and Post, and we sort of developed a friendship. So I get this call one day from Raymond Lambert, and he's like, yeah, Will Haygood gave me your number. I'm looking for somebody to help me write my autobiography. And the first thing I thought was, why is Will Haygood giving my number out to people? But then as Raymond went on telling his story about like how all these, anybody who was, any famous black comedian from the 90s, who got their start in the 90s, like Steve Harvey, Jamie Foxx, even somebody like Carlos Mencia, his club was like the launching pad, and he was like, so I was like, once he got through, and there was already a documentary that aired on Showtime about his club called Funny Business, so I was like, this is really an opportunity I can't pass up. So Raymond and I just kind of like, he was in Chicago, I was here in Columbus, we would just like, he'd write a chapter, I'd kind of look it over and give him notes, I'd write a chapter, send it to him, he'd like kind of rewrite it in his voice. So it was just this collaborative thing back and forth for like maybe 6 or 7 months.
And you mentioned your documentary, Lady Wrestler, which started out as an article, and it morphed into this amazing documentary that you've been able to travel over the country, sharing with people, and it was recently mentioned in the New York Times. So talk to us about like that, from the article to the documentary, and how you put that together.
Yeah, so most of my career has been in print journalism. So there's an African American man named Terry Anderson who works in public relations. So this was back in the mid-2000s. So I would call him periodically for story ideas. And every time I call him, he'd say, there's this really interesting lady I grew up with who, she was some kind of bodybuilder or wrestler. She always had like interesting characters hanging out at her house. You should interview her sometime. So that turned out to be Ethel Johnson, which is like, she was one of the most famous black female wrestlers, actually just female wrestlers, period, ever. So Terry set up an interview with me and her, and she just had these amazing stories of like, at age 15, going all over the world to Canada, Cuba, Japan, Australia, and then when she'd go overseas, she'd be treated like a hero. And then when she traveled in the South, she'd have to go in the backdoor restaurants. She'd have to like step off the sidewalk when a white person was coming toward her. And I just thought, this woman just has an amazing story. So the Dispatch published the article in March of 2006 for Women's History Month. So that was the same time as the Arnold Classic. Arnold Schwarzenegger's people call me up and they're like, this woman is amazing, we want to give her a Lifetime Achievement Award. Ethel was she passed away in September of 2018. She was really shy. She didn't like the limelight, so she said, tell them I said thanks, but no thanks. So I just thought her story, and there were dozens of women like her 2 sisters, Babs and Margaret, were also wrestlers. I just thought, this story is cinematic. It doesn't, it shouldn't just be limited to one newspaper article and a small town newspaper. So I was like, I asked Ethel, I said, would you be willing to speak on camera? And to my surprise, she said yes. And then, so I was able to track down other women like Ramona Isbell. And actually, the University of Notre Dame has this huge wrestling archive, so that's where I did a lot of the research. So it just kind of slow. And Will Haygood, once again, he came through. He was like, you should talk to my friend Jeff Lean. He wrote a book about women's wrestling. So he was like a fountain of information.
So what gave you the idea, like how did you take a story and turn it into film? Because that seems like such a big task for someone who's used to,
Right.
creating stories in print.
Well, back to I always wanted to be a filmmaker. I was always just like, and so this is something I've never talked about before publicly. Actually, before I was working on the documentary with the wrestling ladies, I was actually working on a documentary with the Escobedo family, Sheila E. I had interviewed her several times, and I was like, they have a really interesting story because she's this woman working in this unconventional field. And we had actually done a couple interviews, and just, to make a long story short, I was in Columbus, they were in Los Angeles. The project just never really got off the ground. So I'd already dipped my foot in the filmmaking. So I don't know, when you're a reporter, you learn to like spot story ideas. And so talking to Ethel was just like, this is really an amazing story. It just leaps off the page. And I just thought, this should be more than a newspaper article. And I was just, a part of it was just naivete. I'm like, well, let me just jump in head first. I don't know the first thing about cameras, even though I want to be a filmmaker, but I'll just go buy a, prosumer camera and, figure it out and just kind of learn as I go.
And the relationship you have with OSU, can you talk about?
Yeah, so a guy I went to high school with, a really close friend of mine, Paul Hill, he's the full-time editor at the Wexner Center, which is this, arts center at Ohio State. We went to Fort Hays together. So when I told him I was working on this documentary, he was like, you should come here and do the post-production here. So it's like, they have this awesome post-production facility that's like the best kept secret in Columbus. Like they've had filmmakers from all over the world that come there to do their editing and like, the sound mix and everything. So Paul and the Wexner Center, they were just really, really instrumental in doing the post-production, and they had the premiere there in March of 2018.
Yeah, and that's another like local resource
Yeah.
that's here for people who want to do high quality professional work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So far, I'm going to talk to you next. I thought it was really important to have you on this panel because a lot of people are familiar with your creative work, but I believe that you have to be a good creative business person and keep that lens on as well. And we hear from you a lot, but we never hear about your career. So I wanted to definitely talk to you about that, even though we've talked, So one thing I wanted to bring up, you just graduated from your second master's degree from a university in California.
Yep.
But you're here.
I am.
How did you do that?
Yeah, it was a low-res program, a low residency program, which means I didn't have to be there full-time. So I went there, it was a 2-year program, so I went there twice a year. So 10 days out of each semester, I was in LA, and the rest of it was online. I worked for an organization that allowed me to take time away and to go and do my schooling and then to come back, and it didn't count it against my vacation time. So that was pretty awesome. So yeah, I was able to negotiate that, work that out, and experience LA while at the same time be home.
So how did you decide to go for an MFA? I think it's a little scary for people to like dedicate to a fine art. What was your process in picking that?
That's a great question. I think for me, I wanted to be more structured. I think I was at a place where I grew up in slam, which is competitive poetry. You guys know what poetry slam is, right? Kind of. Okay. So I grew up in slam, which is like performance poetry. It's competitive. But oftentimes in slam, I mean, it's happening now, probably more so, and Scott Woods could probably speak to this a lot better too. But poets in slam, poets from slam weren't really being published. And so I was just at a space where I wanted to take my writing to the next level, and I really felt like an MFA would allow me to do that and open up career opportunities for me. So if you want to teach at a college level, you need the MFA degree to do it. I actually didn't even end up needing to go that route or even explore that opportunity because another job opportunity came my way right when I was leaving upon me completing my degree, so it just kind of worked out.
So I did want to bring that up, and hopefully I don't expose too much. But I seen Barb at Willoughby's one Friday, and she's like, "Yeah, I'm quitting my job." And I'm like, and she's like, "Yeah, I finished my program in about a month, and I'm just gonna quit." And I'm like, "Okay, so what are you gonna do next?" And she's like, "I don't know, we'll see." And I just did a little process. Okay, well, you need me. I'm here for you, Barb. But come to find out, you just been named Artistic Director of the Harmony Project. So talk about like creative leap of faith. Like we all take those. Like how do you, what was your discernment process of quitting and not having a backup?
Yeah, I was just done. I was at a point where I was really done. Like, I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot to that other than that. I saved for a while, so I spent like, I knew that that wasn't my end all be all. And I knew that I wanted to be a writer. Like, I wanted to live and exist in this world as a writer. Not meaning that you have to quit your job to do that. It just, for me and my process and where I was, I really wanted to travel more. I wanted to tour. I wanted to work on a book deal. And so for me, it was just, I was done. I was ready to leave. So I saved. I saved up for like a year and a half, and I tried to be very diligent about that, and just said, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. So I gave myself a date. I had some accountability partners. Some are in the room. And I didn't quit when I said I was going to quit because I was scared. But I eventually just took that leap of faith and said, you know what, it's going to work out. The wild thing about that is I got to LA for my last residency and ended up getting 2 full-time job offers in LA. And then by the time I came back, I had a job offer here. It worked out a little bit better for me. And I wanted to stay home. And so it just worked out. So I took that chance and doors open. So I think sometimes you just got to be willing to follow what it is that you believe you're supposed to do in this world, and follow what you believe you're supposed to do in this world, and know that doors will really open. And God showed up and showed out, y'all. So yes, I'm in a different space than I was when you saw me.
You didn't seem scared. I seen you. So tell us about your new role. Tell us what you'll be doing and what can we expect from you.
So I'm the artistic director of Harmony Project. Harmony Project is an organization that's really geared towards lifting and elevating voices in the community. You probably know it most as the 500 choir, 500 voice choir. And so there are some other programs that are attached to the choir as well. So there are one of the things about being in the choir is that you have to serve. So you have to be able to provide some service to your community. And then there's some programs, so the prisons and the schools, and I'll be helping to expand those programs. So a lot of my background is working in incarceration. And so I'll be doing arts inside the prisons and expanding to the juvenile facilities. They're only right now currently in one men's facility and in ORW, which is the women's prison. And so I'll be expanding to juvenile facilities and then hopefully expanding to some of the men's facilities as well. And then expanding the programs in the schools, which I'm really excited about.
So Miss Erica, this is my journalist, Bay. We talk a lot, we talk every day about writing, other people's writing, what we like, what we don't like. But you are a full-time journalist. You're with the Columbus Dispatch. You were previously with Columbus Alive. So talk to us about what's the day in the life of a journalist?
It's crazy. It's unpredictable. The best part of it is when you can work on like longer, we call them enterprise stories that you're kind of chipping away at. But if there's breaking news, there's breaking news. So you'll have to, like, I'll come into work and then my editor might be like, we need you to go out to this thing, we need you to write this story. And sometimes you might not want to do it. And then other times, like, I'll see a story that no one else is covering and I feel like I need to do it. And part of me, it's a lot of like internal dialogue. So not too long ago, there was a woman who was attacked after the Lizzo concert. She was called a few different slurs for being gay, and I saw it on Facebook, and nobody was really covering it. So I was like, I'm tired. I have so much stuff to do. I don't really want to go do this, but I need to do this because it's an important story. So I just sent my editor an email about it and saying, can I go out and cover this? And so I just dropped everything and did that. So it's just really unpredictable each day.
So you alluded to the craziness of news and journalism. How do you manage that? Like, how do you stay so
Because I love
committed
Wendy, because I know Mike will enjoy it.
It's hard. I mean, I feel like when you can see like the fruits of your labor and that you're like making a difference in the community, when you report on a certain story and people reach out to you and say how much of an impact that you had, or like one example is I did a story on maternal mortality and infant mortality here in Columbus because it's terrible. And then, like, I don't know, months later after that story ran, our governor said that he was going to allocate some more funding toward that issue. And my editor came to me and said, I really think your story made a difference in that. So that's kind of what helps me through the tough times. And like when I was in Cincinnati before I moved here, I saw the job opening for Columbus Alive, and it's the alt weekly, so like we covered a lot of music and restaurants and nightlife, and I kind of thought to myself, oh, this is going to be a nice little thing for me to do while I'm working on my Prince book. But I got here and I ended up becoming a community reporter and reporting on like police-involved killings and all of this, and I just really feel like I found my purpose here by moving here, so that's kind of what keeps me going.
So what do you feel is missing in local news? No. I made jokes in the
It's a difficult question. One answer is, I mean, reporters. We need more reporters out there in the community, and unfortunately the way the industry is, people are getting laid off left and right. We don't have funding to hire people, and so as a result of that, we are lacking coverage on underserved communities here. So I often feel like, sometimes I feel like there's a burden on me because like I get so many people hitting me up, like if there's something going on like in the Black community or like even the LGBTQ community, like they hit me up because they know like I'm a journalist who cares, and they don't know of any other journalists who might do it. So I think that's definitely missing, and I really don't know how we solve that right now, unfortunately.
Yeah. So let's talk about Prince. One thing I admire about you the most is through 2019, you published on your Prince blog every Friday, on top of all the crazy journalism stuff you just talked about. So that's what, 52 stories? Interviewing people who are a part of Prince's life or know about him. So how did you even get into this Prince community?
It's a crazy community too. I don't know if I would recommend it, but it's. I mean, I like since high school is when I like really became a hardcore fan, and I really wasn't online in the Prince fan world, so it was kind of like this isolation. Like I didn't know there were other Prince fans like me like that. But I think after grad school, well, honestly, after he passed away, there started to be these academic conferences popping up around Prince. So one of the very first ones was in Manchester in the UK, and it was actually Donna who saw it and sent it to me like, you need to apply to go to this academic conference and speak on Prince. And I was like, I don't know, but she really. I'm gonna get choked up. Sorry. She really encouraged me to do it. So since he passed, there have been a lot of academic conferences around him, and I've been able to meet other Prince scholars and get into the community that way. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. So if you want to get into this a little bit, I know one of the things that's important to your work is maintaining Prince's Black identity. That sometimes gets lost because we remember all of these things, but he was so dedicated to Black causes in the Black community. How do you keep that in your work as well?
I think I guess it's always something I have a focus on because I'm black, as simple as that may sound. And like when I unpack like why I love him so much, it's because he's a black person like me who has been able to accomplish these extraordinary things. But it's important that we keep it alive because for so long, especially when he was with us, all of the critics and journalists were white, writing about our music, writing about Prince. And so it's just important to me to keep that side of him alive. And people, like, whether they watch Purple Rain and think he's really biracial, like Chris was talking about, or they hear some of his music about, like, racial harmony, and they kind of misinterpret that to think that he was, like, running away from his blackness. So I just try to be mindful, and like I said, it's kind of easy just because that's part of the reason why I like him.
Thank you. So one thing, I mean, I'm sure you all know this, is you all have multiple hustles going on and full-time jobs and passion projects. How do you find balance? Like, how do you keep this all moving?
You know, it's interesting because there's this commentator I watch on YouTube, this young black woman. Her channel's called For Harriet. And she's done a couple videos lately about workaholism. Like there was a video that Tyler Perry posted about like all these like this pile of scripts, and he was like work ethic, and she was like, you know, working till you drop this whole capitalist mindset of you know, you should feel guilty if you're not working every waking moment. I think we need to get out of that because, as she said eloquently in one of her videos, it's like you can do good work, you can work hard, but running yourself into the ground and feeling like you should never have any free time, I don't think that's healthy. So for me, there's never a perfect balance. A lot of times it's like me getting up at the crack of dawn before my day job, or you know, doing stuff on weekends and not really seeing. I mean, I'm not married, I don't have kids, so that's, you know, that freaks me up in a sense. But I have a large extended family and I have a lot of friends, and you know, so sometimes I feel guilty if I spend the weekend working on, you know, one of my passion projects. I don't see my friends and family. Conversely, if I spend the weekend hanging out, I'm like, oh, I'm a slacker. I should have been like Prince, holed up in my, office working 24/7. So there's never a perfect balance.
No wonder.
Yeah, I don't have balance really, but I'm not married and I don't have kids either, so that blew me up in different ways. One of the things that I started doing was making sure that my Mondays and my Fridays were free. Like my Monday evenings and my Friday evenings were free. So that way I can just sleep and rest and recharge. So I won't book shows on Friday. I did last night, but that was a little different story. But typically I don't book shows on Fridays and Mondays, and that helps give me some balance. Deion Custer Edwards, she told me like a while ago that she gets up every morning and writes at like 5 a.m. And I've tried to do that, but I'm a night owl, so my brain just doesn't function really that early. So what I do is I stay up later and make sure that I'm getting something on paper at least every night. So either in my phone or physically on paper, I'm writing something down, whether it's a line or a word, and that kind of helps keep that creativity going. And try to sleep as much as I can.
Donna, I'm going to ask you to answer this after I go as a mom, because I'm not married, I don't have kids. So I struggle with balance too, but I think really having friends and family in your life that kind of keep you accountable in that way, like Donna said, let's go do this. Like even being here tonight is like keeping me from like stressing out about work, or like come over and have dinner, whatever. So I think just really trying to lean on friends and family and make sure you're spending time with them. But otherwise, it's a work in progress for me. It's something I'm learning.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I have a 5-year-old and I'm not married. But I would say for the first 4 years of his life, I've really been pouring into him. And now we're at a place where he needs to understand my life. So we're kind of shifting. I call him my editorial assistant. So he's going to be working for all of y'all very soon. But yeah, I mean, I'm not a typical type of mom. So I had to get out of the mindset of like, oh, I have to be in bed at this time and up. You know, I lean on Toni Morrison's example of waking up at 5. She had 2 children and she was a single mother as well. And then in her writing room, she always left the door open. So it was never like, I'm writing, leave me alone. And imagine having 2 little kids and you're still writing to that level. Like, but I mean, you know, just letting him see me write. Like, okay, we're playing, but I'm also writing, or we're going to this poetry reading, or, you know, so bringing him into my life at this point. He doesn't have as many like pressing needs, so he needs to understand like what my creative life is. So I guess that's my. So my final question, and then we'll open up to the audience. What's up? What's on the horizon for you? The next year, the next 5 years? What are you going to be doing? Where are we going to see you?
Well, you met the chef, huh?
When my hip hop album drops. So I shot a new movie last summer called Things Are Tough All Over. It's about a black family struggling through the Great Recession of 2008. So I'm in the process of editing that, and I hope to release that. The documentary, I've had like individual screenings, so I hope to like finally release it on DVD and streaming, because I have like wrestling fans from all over the world. Literally, like somebody from Istanbul, Turkey was like, can I get a copy? So I keep telling these people, I promise I'm going to release it soon. So finally release that. And then I have my fiction series. It's called The Chloe Chronicles. I'm actually re-releasing the first book and releasing the series.
That's awesome. Well, that's not that exciting. I'm just still writing. I'm hoping to get my manuscript published in a new career space. So working. I'm starting a new workshop at the OSU Trauma Recovery Center. So I'll be there weekly, as well as at Transit Arts. So I'm at Transit Arts weekly. So if there's any teens, or you know of any teens who want to do some writing, send them to me on Thursday evenings.
For me, I'm committed to finishing my Prince book this year. Also, I have like one of those longer enterprise stories I was telling you about coming out to Dispatch. I can't say what it's about, but hopefully at the end of January that'll be out. Continuing to write stories that serve underserved communities in the city, and I have a couple of Prince conferences I'm going to this year. One is at NYU, and one is in Minneapolis.
So thank you. Continue to chill and talk amongst each other. Brian, do you want to say a little bit about Moby here?
So thanks everybody for coming out. C-Bus Libraries is a nonprofit organization here in Central Ohio. We bring our mobile little library out to festivals all across Central Ohio, and we give free books out to the community. If you have books that you'd like to donate, please take one of our cards. But what we have here is all free and all for you tonight. So please do take something. Thank you so much.
He actually likes it when he doesn't have to.
Exactly.
Take books back. So come up and engage in the books. So continue to chill, continue to interact with